Hi, this is Adam from Recreation Services, and as part of our resistance band series, we're going to be doing some tips about the uses of resistance bands and how you can implement them so that after these next few weeks, you're able to take them and add them into your program, whether you're working at home or back in the gym when that's permitted. The great thing about resistance bands compared to dumbbells or barbells or kettlebells is that you don't have to rely on gravity. So it lets you change the direction of pull as long as you can anchor the bands some way, so you can then add the stretch to get the resistance. So you don't need to think about gravity quite the same way as you would with other implements. So there's two types of bands. So there's a monster band, which is the longer bands, usually in the 3.5 foot range or so. And then there's mini bands, which are somewhere in the 10 to 12 inch range, give or take. And then the mini bands also, there's kind of fabric versions of those, which then add more resistance. So for this, we're going to be focusing on the monster bands and the rubber mini bands. And we'll talk about how to use those safely, storage, how to inspect them, and then we'll go from there. So the monster bands, the bigger bands, sometimes called the power bands, depending on the brand you're looking at, typically used to add resistance or assistance to larger movements or larger muscle groups. So one primary use for the monster bands is to add assistance for pull-ups. So you can do assisted pull-ups, especially if you're unable to do any pull-ups or just not many, so you want to be able to add more volume. It gives you a little bit of a lift, but it can also be used to add resistance to, say, squats or deadlifts or other movements like that. You can also use larger or stronger monster bands to add resistance or to give you a little bit of pull to help you work on mobility or stretching exercises or things like that. So it's not necessarily just a strength building tool. So the monster bands are typically used for larger movements, although depending on the strength of the band, you could use them for more isolated movements as well, like bicep curls and things like that. The mini bands are a lot shorter in length, typically used for smaller muscle groups or adding a little bit of resistance to help you focus on different things during larger movements. So for example, you can use it to help fix technique during, say, a squatting movement, or to get you to emphasize a certain part of your squat. So if you have it around your legs or around your knees while you're doing a squat, it helps you focus on keeping the knees out to help prevent that knee collapse during a squat. But you can also use it for resistance for, say, the upper back or shoulders or arms. Used a lot for the glutes as well, so you can focus on the abductors and adductors through the hips. Also used a lot during core exercises, so it helps you kind of add a little bit to your core movements at home when you're doing body weight core, but you want to add a little something to that. Mini bands are great for that. One thing to consider when you're using bands is checking them for wear and tear. So one of the things to make sure is that there's no cracks or tears within your band. Sometimes if they get dried out and just worn out from overstretching, they start to have little micro tears, and that starts to affect the structural integrity of the bands. So you want to check them before use or fairly regularly, just to make sure there's no rips or tears starting to form there. You also want to make sure that when you're cleaning them, to only use a damp cloth, so don't use any other soap or cleaning detergents or anything like that can start to deteriorate the bands themselves. When using the bands, you also want to make sure not to jerk the bands, so not pull them too hard, and also when you're letting them go, never to release from full tension so they don't snap back or anything like that. You also don't want to overstretch the bands, so you don't want to stretch them beyond 2.5 times their resting length. That's kind of where it starts to get into a dangerous spot where you could get some rips and tears or failure that way. So just be mindful of that. And when storing your bands, try to make sure it's in a dark, cool space. So you don't want it near a heat source or exposed to direct sunlight, as that could lead to some drying out and breaking down of the bands as well. So in the next couple weeks, we'll talk about how to use them in other ways, different advanced techniques with the bands. But hopefully this gets you started, and enjoy using your bands.